Welcome to Internet Changemakers, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes of the internet's past, present, and future. Join us as we dive into the biggest challenges and opportunities in online trust, privacy, accessibility, and the ever-evolving digital landscape. Whether you're a tech expert or just curious about the internet's impact on your life, this podcast is your gateway to understanding and shaping a trustworthy, open, and accessible online world. Stay tuned, because the future of the internet starts with you.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of our Internet Changemakers podcast. This is our 5th episode, and our topic today is youth and elderly. I would like to welcome our guests, Kim Ochs and Isaac Carrasco Ortiz. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both so much for joining us. And I think this is such an important episode to be talking about right now, as older adults face challenges that many of us don't have to think about, and so do youth. As Noha shared, Kim Ochs and Isaac Carrasco Ortiz will be joining us today. Isaac is the former Digital Equity Fellow at the Executive Office of Aging and Independence and a current graduate student at Trinity College studying digital humanities and culture. Kim is an education tech strategist, learning and cognitive coach, and alumna of the Mid-Career Fellowship. So I would first like to start with Isaac and ask you a question that we ask many of our guests. What is your favorite website or application of the internet?
My favorite website has to be, without a doubt, a website called A Soft Murmur. A soft murmur is, as best as I could describe it, a white noise, background noise generator where you can play with certain options to create your own level of background noise while you work. I like to have a little bit of noise while I work, whether it's trees or rain or noise, any noise that can fit in the background. It's my go-to website when I'm working, and I love it so much.
Wow, that sounds so nice and soothing. That sounds brilliant. What about you, Kim? What is your favorite application or use of the internet?
At the moment, I'm experimenting a lot with AI, and Perplexity.ai has become one of my go-tos, both from a research perspective in particular, but I'm also starting to experiment a little bit with vibe coding, which is proving to be very entertaining.
Awesome. Thank you. And before we dive in a little bit more into this episode, Kim, could you please start us off by sharing a little bit about how do you define older adults and how do you define digital literacy?
Thanks for the question, Claire. I think with digital literacy, there's a framework actually that I've been using in my work, which is originally from Van Dersen and Van Dyke. I think it's helpful here. So when we talk about digital literacy, there's sort of 4 levels. Operational, so that's how you're using digital technologies. 2 is formal skills, so managing the structures of digital media. 3 is information, so how people are finding information online. 4th is sort of strategic skills, so translating the digital information to personal professional development. And I'll add a 5th one, particularly with this population, which is security skills. So having secure access to personal information, being aware of social engineering tactics, scammers, and that kind of thing. That's one framework.
Thank you. And I would love to hear your opinion as well, Isaac, if it differs at all from Kim's.
I think that Kim has illustrated it very nicely. The only other thing that I would add is the importance of confidence and instilling a person's ability to access the different digital tools that they have available, what tools they would like to use, what websites they would like to navigate. It's also an important factor, a person's own confidence when engaging with different digital tools, either that they have used for a long time or maybe they're engaging with it for the first time. That confidence, that sort of exploratory confidence, is very key to a person's ability to use their digital tools effectively.
Thank you, Kim and Isaac, for putting this very nicely and well structured, like this 360 framework. My question to Isaac is, what first led you to working with other adults on digital literacy, and what did that community work look like on the ground?
So this kind of work with digital literacy and older adults, I happened to stumble upon it actually. It was not something that I knew that I needed to be working in. My background was in sociology. I stumbled into this kind of work in the United States serving as an AmeriCorps member. I had served for 2 years. In my first year, I did primarily technology classes for a local nonprofit in the Boston area. And in my second year, I did more behind the scenes project management work for digital literacy training geared for older adults in different towns and municipalities in the state of Massachusetts. Like I said, it's not something that I set out to do. It's something that I stumbled upon. But as I was working in classrooms, as I got to meet people who are of different ages than me, being a much younger person, I realized just how important it was to see this as an issue to address in whatever way that I could. And it was something that I grew to become much more passionate about, seeing how people's lives intersected with the digital world. In what ways is it positive? In what ways is it negative? How is it affecting a person? How they see themselves? All of that jumbled together into something much more beautiful than I could have ever imagined when I first set out to work on this kind of effort.
And how did it shape your experience as a facilitator or instructor?
For sure, absolutely. Well, one, being a younger person, I not only understood better how to work with older adults. It's one thing to work with older adults, it's another thing to teach people how to use technology, and it's a third thing entirely to know how to teach older adults about technology. It's a very specific framework and level of skills that you need to accomplish each sort of approach effectively. I learned a lot not only about how people were seeing technology in the time that we are in today as a world. Older generations did not grow up with the internet. They might have learned about computers at some point in their careers, though certainly not early on in their careers. So there's a certain level of digital know-how that they're familiar with that is different from what younger people might know. So it's that sort of higher level understanding of how people of different ages are engaging with technology that I really learned to cherish as a younger person. But also, it kind of gave me an insight as to what the world could look like when I become an older adult, what sorts of things I might have to look at, think about, and analyze in the technology, however it might look like in the future. It really gave me a much more empathetic and curious lens about how the ways that people of different ages are engaging with the digital world.
Thank you so much, Isaac. And you bring up this really interesting point that many young folks have grown up with the internet their entire lives. They don't know a life without it. But older adults, many of them had to adopt the internet as a technology later on in their lives. They have lived majority of their lives without this technology. And that presents all these different kinds of challenges. And when you juxtapose those two different groups, you see this very unique challenge that is very special to this time, because we don't know how many generations it will be before we are all digital natives. And I would like to throw this question to Kim. I know that you have classroom experience having 3 generations in one classroom. How have you seen technology use differ with the generations you've had in your class?
As I had mentioned to you before, sort of when I was teaching as a professor and administrator in online education, my youngest students were in their early 20s and the oldest were in their late 60s and 70s. So they were truly across the gamut. And what I'd say is I really found 3 myths. First is this myth that digital literacy is associated with age. So we had digital natives in their 20s, but they weren't necessarily comfortable recording videos on their mobile phones for assignments. We also had some older students who were really early tech adopters. So you'd see things like Lotus 123 classes on their transcripts from the 1990s, or they were registering with an AOL address. So they had actually been using it quite a long time. But at the same time, you had both of this entire spectrum arriving with no idea how to use a learning management system, which is the foundation for an online classroom. So it was a reminder that the younger groups and the older adults were both very heterogeneous groups, and we sort of can't talk about both as 2 groups, but there's a lot of difference between those. The second myth, and I think this is problematic and sort of ties back to what Isaac was saying too, is we have this deficit model when we have thoughts about when it comes to older adults learning. And the reality is that older adults, as Isaac was saying too, have these distinct physical, emotional, and learning needs. And we're seeing this distinction now. So in public policy and in countries like Singapore, where there's a very large old demographic, you see in their policy as well, there's this distinction between pedagogy, which is teaching children, andragogy, which is teaching adults, and geragogy, which is teaching older adults, and sort of acknowledging that digital literacy and other types of learning has to identify what that looks like because it is very different for older people. And then the third myth is really that the internet is more important to one demographic than the other. And I think when we were in the online classroom, there were a lot of assumptions about aim everything and develop the learning materials towards the younger, when the reality is that people across the board were engaging in education for very different reasons. They wanted to gain skills. They ended up getting life-changing employment. They wanted to start a new chapter in their lives. So it's really about understanding what their needs are at their different ages, what is motivating them. But learning is it's a personal experience. And the rewarding thing was really seeing this cross-generational learning from each other and students taking it upon themselves to help each other create a safe space to ask questions. And it's really inspiring to watch this happen because it's natural when people enter a classroom with, decades and decades of experience and may not be comfortable asking, well, hang on, how do I connect my phone to my computer? It's different when people come into the classroom afraid to ask questions. And that's important in sort of fostering this community where it is safe.
Yeah, thank you, Kim, for sharing this aspect. I hope we can, as younger generations, millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, I hope we can stop judging older generations because they didn't have this luxury we had growing up, and offer them help and offer them support. And I would love to hear if you can share a story with us of an example of an elderly person who approached this topic or wanted to learn more about digital skills because maybe they were forced to do it or maybe they were eager to learn more. Do you have any stories, any interesting stories to share?
There are stories. One that jumps to mind, though, and it really comes down to this motivation of connection, right? People use the internet for different reasons and about staying connected. So, on the learning side, you see one end of the spectrum, you see people who have used technology in some way throughout their careers, who were there using PCs at the beginning of the PC revolution, were using different things. And they're the ones who are using Grok, using Perplexity, using AI tools as a teaching method. So, for example, it's actually a personal example, but a good one was someone was trying to help another person learn about how to do something specifically. And they sort of entered into Perplexity or Grok or one of these AI tools and basically had it create a tutorial. And they were able to take the tutorial, print out the tutorial, give it to the person who wasn't familiar with it. And so it's about meeting the person where they are at and what they're familiar with. But I think, again, it's also about wanting to stay connected, wanting to be skilled. I think there are a lot of misassumptions about aging also, which is the reality is the workforce is getting older. People do need to keep their skills. People are working longer. And there is a desire to learn more on that side of things. I also think in the sense of it is a privilege to grow up and to grow up with the internet. On the other hand, those of us who have sort of seen both worlds, and I'm a little bit older, I'm Gen X, there's also an appreciation for going at a different pace or slowing down a bit. And one of the things that when you talk about geragogy is the acknowledgement that the pace of learning is very different and the different tools, sort of a mixture of paper, a mixture of digital tools, and how that can be bridged is also important.
What comes to mind when you're saying all of this is how we always say that young people's brains are like sponges. But then on the other hand, there's the whole saying of, can you teach an old dog new tricks? So there's these two sides of the coin where as a society, we understand that they learn differently. But on a practical level, it seems like many people don't understand how we translate these different learning systems. I mean, this is the first time I'm learning about geragogy. And I think that is such a great term to have, particularly because I'm sure the embarrassment can come up. I'm sure that there's levels of shame. And as Isaac said, building that confidence. But do you find that when people say things like, okay, boomer, or teaching an old dog new tricks, do you think that actually has a negative impact on confidence levels of older adults who are actually trying to really put themselves out there and learn these new skills?
It absolutely does. And first thing, scientifically, it's wrong. There's two types of intelligence. There's fluid intelligence, which is what you describe and is what is associated with youth, which is learning new things. And that does decline, starts to decline after the age of 30. Then there's crystallized intelligence, which is based on knowledge, and that grows exponentially for as long as you live. So that's the theory where there's a lot of talk in the education world and the psychology world, neurology world about lifelong learning. And there's value to that. But the ageism, it does create, as you were saying, Claire, it does create shame and it does create problem. And frankly, it's a lost opportunity and a real market problem when you really think about it. It's a lost market opportunity when you look at the forecasts in Europe, in the Asia Pacific region. By 2050, around 25% of the population is over the age of 60. So we really need to be thinking and rethinking about these assumptions, about this deficit model, and talk more about the value that experience brings and creating pathways and bridges between younger people and more experienced people to have important learning moments and opportunities.
And it seems like what you're talking about is actually what Isaac does on the ground. So I would love to ask you, Isaac, when you see these older adults experiencing feelings of shame and embarrassment, what can you do on your side to help them get over those feelings and continue to inspire them to learn?
Absolutely. I think this is where the heart of the matter is, because I think what happens with these feelings of shame is that we enter spaces of vulnerability. So I wouldn't even be able to count how many times I heard from older adults that I worked with that, oh, you know what? You're younger. You probably know how to do this. And I learned to recognize, to take the initiative to be very upfront about my own technological skills, about how I might be particularly familiar with this or how actually I'm not familiar with this. So, for example, some folks that I worked with and when I used to spend time in libraries and senior centers, they would come up to me and ask questions about their Android phones. I have an iPhone. So there was also a certain level of vulnerability that I had to enter to also learn, one, how exactly the Android phone might differ in terms of the interface, the functionality to, say, an iPhone, but also how a person who uses an Android is making that Android their home, which might be different from the way I make sense of my phone. So being upfront with that, right? Just being upfront and saying, well, to be honest, I don't know much about this either, but I say at least we can work on it together and maybe we can find an answer today. Maybe we'll find the answer tomorrow. But I think it's the ability to enter that vulnerability together and really create that safe space where questions can be asked, where learnings are made. And not only do we have a really great then working relationship moving forward, but also they may start to ask the questions that they really have, that now that they've built some trust, that can really start to pose to, say, a person like me. And we can really start to pick apart the questions that they've had for a long time.
Thank you, Isaac. Creating safe spaces for the several generations in a single class or a single environment is definitely needed. So I want to ask you about your opinion, or what do you think are the benefits for youth to be in a cross-generational or intergenerational environment?
Yes, that is a brilliant question, because not only I'm smiling because this is something that I found developing within myself in this kind of work. I'll try to be brief. I could speak forever and ever, but I'll try to narrow it down to a couple main points. One, as I mentioned earlier, working with older adults, and as Kim very correctly pointed out, how different people have different levels of technological skills and other skills that they may have acquired on their own or through their careers. The fact of the matter is that me being born in 2001, there's a level of the digital world that I just simply never experienced, just because I wasn't born during that time. So getting to speak with people of other ages who maybe can clue me in as to a bit of the history of the digital world and how things ended up with the way that they are now gave me great clarity as to the inner workings behind why this technology that I'm looking at right now looks the way that it does. Learning about how the internet might have been rolled out in the 90s, super helpful, not only as myself as a professional and getting as a younger person looking to provide a particular service, but also just a great talking point that allowed me and the people that we worked with to bond together over, oh, I wasn't familiar with that technology. Can you maybe explain more about how it was? So that sort of inviting level of conversation that levels the floor between instructor and student to more of a peer-to-peer supportive network, so to speak. The other very important point for youth that I think is so, so helpful, and I wish that every young person who might be listening to this might be able to, in some way, shape, or form, take this to heart. It's the fact that by working with people of different ages, you start to imagine what kind of world might be existing for you when you become a part of the older generation. One point that I really take sort of issue, not in a bad sense, but just something that I keep key to address at some point, as Kim mentioned, is the idea of ageism. Ageism affects people of all ages. We have these erroneous thinkings that older people may not be able to comprehend technology in a particular way, which in some ways is correct, but of course it's not a monolith. But also that younger people, because they're young, they know everything about technology, which also that's not the case at all. There's a certain level of understandings that we've created according to the world as we live it. I could not stress more how thankful I am as a younger person to be engaging in this work, because I start to think about, well, if we are struggling with ageism, if we are struggling with a quote unquote digital ageism, then how might that look like when I'm 65 or older? In what ways am I going to struggle to come to terms with the way that the world is constructed when I become that age? It really puts it in frame for me to think about what actions I can take now as a professional, and also in what way I can move with my relationships working with older adults and people of all generations, so that we really approach this idea of digital illiteracy as less of an age issue and more of a technology human synchronicity effort where people can feel more comfortable and confident engaging with their respective digital tools, irrespective of where they come from or their backgrounds.
I totally agree that it's also our responsibility as young generations, young persons, to support keeping this ecosystem inclusive, keeping the internet inclusive, keeping the internet inclusive of all ages, all backgrounds. And this is for our benefit and for the benefit of the future of the internet.
I would like to transition a little bit over to the trust and safety side of digital literacy for older adults. I think we all have heard the horrible, very scary, devastating stories of scams that have completely decimated the financial health and well-being of older adults, and the myriad of other challenges they face in terms of trust and safety and scams. Even misinformation falls into that bucket. And I would love to hear from both of you because you both have such unique perspectives, but I'll start with you, Kim. How do you address trust and safety with older adults in particular in regards to their susceptibility to scams and any other kind of threats to their well-being?
I think there are two ways to respond to this. So one is on the level that we've been talking about a lot, which is sort of the user experience. And Isaac has a lot of experience and background in that one. Also, I should highlight on this point, ISOC Mexico chapter just did some amazing work as well on sort of educating people about dangers of the internet. I want to flip it a little bit to the background and looking at the internet backbone and the susceptibilities there, which is something I really didn't appreciate until I started working more with organizations and in organizations. So there's a lot of work that ISOC has done, other organizations continue to do, sort of looking at community networks and community structures. And as an example, one thing that's happening a lot with older populations is there's sort of two levels. One is the group that is senior communities or also senior housing where everyone is sort of living together. And those infrastructures used to be the case that people would have land phone lines and do things securely there, and then they have sort of the internet. A lot of that has changed now to the point where, and I'm talking specifically in the US context, to some extent in Europe as well. But when you look at sort of the telephony and the infrastructure piece, as an example, when everything is specifically online, you have to look at vulnerabilities there as well. So I'll give you an example of being actually physically happened to be in a building, which was a care home when they lost the internet for about 8 hours on that day. So you learned how much is dependent on the internet and where the vulnerabilities are. So they lost their telephony system. You couldn't make a phone call. They lost their internet. You couldn't send emails. They lost their fax. You couldn't send faxes to the medical staff or professionals in hospitals. And most importantly, you actually lost the ability in this particular place, not a good practice, the ability to administer medications because all of those systems were also attached to the internet. So you sort of look at this and say it touches so many aspects that we don't really know or pay attention to and where those vulnerabilities are. And the expectation was that the staff should know how to manage this, and that was held differently. But as a caregiver or a paid caregiver there, people were given hotspots and sort of said, okay, well, you can use your mobile phone device and here's access to a hotspot. But if there isn't training on that level, that doesn't happen. So I think on that side of things, it's important to mention just in terms of how pervasive the internet is at these different levels. And that when we're talking about vulnerabilities, when you're talking about community centers, it's often very similar to schools that you may have an IT department or people in charge of IT, but are they looking at vulnerabilities at these different levels? And in the same way that schools and universities are great targets for hacks, it does raise a flag and what the implications are at that level if these things could happen. So on that side, I think that's things to look about. And also, there's a lot of opportunities there in terms of tech companies and other stakeholders, medical providers to really focus on what are appropriate solutions when you look at all of the different people that are involved in sort of these older adult communities. It's not just them, it's the medical professionals, it's the caregivers, it's the family members, all of whom you have vulnerabilities at these different points in time or points on the landscape.
Thank you, Kim. And what would you say about that question, Isaac, especially since you've spent time on the ground with these folks? What kind of trust and safety challenges have you helped seniors through?
I think this is definitely a very difficult task to undergo, especially considering the level of sensitive information that sometimes may be handled when it comes to either, say, looking at bill information online, looking to access health information online. It's very pertinent and sensitive data that can be tied to a person. And so that in and of itself is a bit difficult to try and address in a way that's respective of that person's sensitive data and also actually helping answer their questions that they may have about that level of information on those portals. What I will say is that every person is unique in their understanding and their comfortability in what they can access at what point with which devices. I know that some people were very apprehensive about the thought of accessing their medical information online on, say, a computer or on a mobile app on their phone because of the very fact that it is medical information. It's very sensitive information. So, that in and of itself, to kind of complement what Kim answered and explained very well, is that you have those issues with the different parameters and the security levels with the internet infrastructure itself. And then you also have that person, a particular user or person, their ability on how comfortable they feel using then that service, because it could be that maybe a device or a particular application is created for the benefit of a particular older adult or a group of people, but maybe the confidence or a particular group of people's skills aren't there yet to be able to use that kind of application or platform. And so it's really meeting people where they're at. Yeah, it truly is a sense of meeting people where they're at with their necessities and their particular unique circumstances and being flexible to adapt to try and find an answer around what best suits them.
If I can just add one point on this too, to piggyback on what Isaac said about meeting people where they're at. One of the initiatives I think is really important is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, in terms of designing websites, designing apps so that it really takes into consideration what accessibility issues there might be, whether it's eyesight or hearing or other things. Color contrast is a big one. And it doesn't necessarily mean just developers. It's also individual organizations, individual people with websites can sort of look at these guidelines and just look at contrast ratios, for example, and drastically improve the readability and accessibility of the information. So there's on the skills side, there's one aspect. There's also just sort of the actually making it as user friendly as possible.
I 100% agree with what Kim has said.
Thank you, Kim and Isaac. I want to reflect on what you've both mentioned and ask about the importance of multi-stakeholderism in this ecosystem and how different stakeholders can support elderly people and minimize frauds and scams because they are seen as a vulnerable group. Question is for both of you, but Isaac, if you would like to go, and then Kim can respond.
Absolutely. This was certainly at the heart of my second year in AmeriCorps, that multi-stakeholder engagement piece. Really, I don't think that there isn't a place for anybody at the table when it comes to engaging, specifically with scams and fraud. To give a little bit of context, in my second year, I was with the state of Massachusetts, the Executive Office of Aging and Independence, where I helped more behind the scenes project management and advising for the different grants that the state had provided for different entities within the state of Massachusetts to pursue digital literacy for older adults programs. The topic of scams and frauds definitely came up many times. And so what we saw in these different projects and in these different programs was that multi-stakeholder engagement piece. Some municipalities chose to engage with their local law enforcement. Others worked with local banks to speak about financial fraud. Others had different teachers and instructors come in to share their own perspectives about financial literacy and online well-being. We also had social workers come in who could provide social expertise through their social work training. There is definitely a place for many different institutions to get involved in, especially to address a very precarious situation that is scams and frauds for older adults. And so whatever works for the group, whatever older adults feel more comfortable engaging with, whether it is the law enforcement or whether it is with local social workers that may be already working with a community institution at the time, it's important for both project management staff, important for the lead coordinators of the different activities, and for different community engagement officers to understand what the needs of their constituents are, to then understand what could be the best partners to engage with. And it would look different for every entity who participates in that. But at the heart, truly at the heart, is to engage with that older adults feel most comfortable engaging with themselves.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to what Isaac said specifically. I think you really covered a lot of that. The one thing I'll just go back to is this phrase that we use of older adults. And I'll give you a concrete example. I was doing a memory training with a group of people, and I had no idea who was going to show up. And in the older adults, the youngest person was 62 and the oldest was 105. So when we have that band of many generations, it's something we need to think about. So older adults also constitutes people who are still actively working pre-retirement, in which case the employers play a huge role. And we were talking earlier about ageism. That is an aspect there about, is there a place for digital literacy in the workplace? Yes. What does that look like? Does it need to look like for different generations? Can it be intergenerational? Probably. When you look at people who are sort of in this retirement age or sort of new, what that looks like. A lot of the term older adults, we have these ideas about people who are infirm. There's also people who are very active, very vitally engaged in using the internet in all different ways. And then, as we were talking earlier, when you are talking about sort of more in the healthcare sector of what that does look like, it is a really different group of stakeholders. I think it's important to consider, what do we mean by older adults? As Isaac was saying, what are their needs? And also, who do they perceive the stakeholders are? And open and sort of actually to do some discovery around that, which is, who are the stakeholders at these different groups? Who does need to be involved? And who is already involved? Who can take the leadership? So there's already in the ISOC community some amazing groups and initiatives already that have targeted this. I think there's a lot to learn from what they're doing. I can think of, in particular, the ISOC, the IHOFR, Laura Breeden, and the National Digital Inclusion Alliance in the U.S. what they're doing in terms of tools to asset map and community-led solutions. So I think there's a lot of resources that within the Internet Society, members and people interested can tap into already, and sort of learning from, to Isaac's point earlier, learning from people who have done this before in different contexts and trying to apply it to what the issues are today.
Thank you so much for that, Kim and Isaac. It's really great to hear you share the importance of community in this. It lends to the idea of collective responsibility, that we are all digital citizens in our own ways. And that means that we all need to find a way to give back to our digital society in the ways that we can. And sometimes that will mean working with older adults, and sometimes that will mean working with youth on internet safety topics. And it's almost like a horseshoe of a challenge for these two groups, meaning older adults and youth, because I feel like so many of the challenges they face are at a safety level, but they come on different angles. And when you think about a community ecosystem of learning, do you find the better model would be to have older adults who are quite digital literate teaching older adults? Or do you think that intergenerational learning is really the key here to a healthy community ecosystem of digital literacy? And now I would ask Kim.
That is a great question, Claire. So at its heart, we know that learning is very emotional. We learn when we are intrinsically motivated. So I think to answer that question, it's about, where do we have natural learning relationships? So intergenerational happens naturally with families, with grandparents and grandchildren. We have peer learning happens often in work environments where people want to have, as we talked about earlier, this sort of the safe space. So I think it's about, when we're talking about community, understanding also, where is the expertise? Where is the willingness to learn and learn from each other? And in terms of how can we get the most people developing a common understanding so that they learn exponentially from each other. But I think it will look different in different environments and different cultures. That's something we haven't talked a lot about. And the way in which we use the internet is so different in different cultures and different regions of the world. So that's another aspect I think we need to take into consideration in developing these communities and how we define community as well.
Yeah, love that answer. And I will ask Isaac something very similar, which is, when you look at communities of learning, particularly in digital literacy, what challenges have you seen in terms of adoption? So we think about what we all owe each other as digital citizens. And I think that you do really amazing work with seniors in the Massachusetts area. And from your experience, how has the learning even been received?
Right. This is, I think, at the heart. If there were multiple hearts of the matter, I think this would certainly be one of them. And it's the fact that not everybody, we all have different uses and perceived benefits for the different digital technologies that we have at our disposal. But at the same time, since we are moving towards an increasingly digitized and digitally reliant world, it's becoming increasingly more difficult to opt out of certain circumstances. And instead, it's becoming more increasingly required of us to engage with the digital world. This is something that I struggled both as an instructor, as a facilitator of technology, of digital literacy work for older adults, but also as myself, as a purely philosophical point of being a younger person growing up in this day. It's a constant tug, I believe, between what it is that someone is looking to learn because they know that it is something that they will definitely use. So for instance, a ride sharing app that they will be able to take note of and be able to use to visit family, and the struggle between knowing that there's certain technology that they have to use or certain digital tools that are being required of us as an increasingly digitally reliant world that are less appealing to us. And so when it comes to that level of adoption, that is certainly at the heart of the matter, especially in the day that we live in today, where, as Kim mentioned earlier, the increasing reliance, the increasing strong networks of our technological infrastructure that becomes reliant to the point where you need to be able to have internet access to look at very important health information or even to take your medications. I mean, there's this reliance on the internet where it starts to become more of a we have to learn instead of we wish to learn. And that's where there's a lot of friction. And that was something that I really tried to find middle ground with, but it is very much like walking a thin tightrope.
If I can just add one point to Isaac, what you were saying about this friction, that's something I've seen a lot as well. And that's something we have to accept too, that there are some people who, of any age, will not use the internet to the extent that they, quote, should. Like there are people who opt not to have a smartphone and to stick with their flip phone. So I think one of the aspects, again, and this goes back to your question, Claire, about community, is in those cases, how do we also make sure that those people are not excluded? So is it empowering in some situations with seniors who have health issues? Is it how do we empower the caregiver to use the apps, to use the technologies in partnership with that person? We talk about it as if the app or the internet or whatever is the solution to everything, but we have to accept that it's people at the center of this, and it's their choice that's also important. And how do we empower the people that want to be empowered?
I love how this conversation went and how everyone of any age can be engaged in this conversation and can have their say. And we all know and acknowledge that internet is a digital right for all humans from all ages and should be inclusive, and anyone can access any of the web tools and applications. But I want to close our conversation with the last question for you both. Looking ahead, like in 40, 50 years, what do you imagine the digital challenges will be for today's younger generation when they become older adults? Isaac, can you start, please?
Absolutely. I think I can only speak for the present right now. It's definitely the fact that we've seen a lot of AI in the news, a lot of buzzwords about what AI is, what it means, how it's built, where its information comes from, who's in charge of that information, who decides what is and is not used for different tools. I would imagine that moving forward, we're going to also see a friction between what constitutes a human machine relationship and a human to human relationship and a machine to machine relationship. I think that there's a plethora of information and questions to be had there from the philosophical level, from the biological level, psychological level, sociological level. But I really think it's going to be a pressing concern how we as human beings are going to see ourselves as we form bonds with each other, form bonds with machines, and to what extent is that going to change how we are going to define ourselves? I mean, if you look up on ChatGPT, if you were to ask ChatGPT, what does beauty mean? ChatGPT is going to give you a definition, but if I ask my dad what he thinks beauty means, it's going to be tied to what my dad thinks. If I ask my mom what she thinks beauty stands for, she's going to give me an answer. So I think in the future, if I had any power or privilege to say anything about the future, I would say that it is going to be increasingly important to tease out what exactly will constitute a human to human relationship, how we should or should not form creations or bonds with our different machines and different digital tools that we have available, and to clearly delineate what is and is not appropriate for both of these types of relationships. I think that the young people of today, this is something that I see it with my friends, I see it with myself, something that we're already struggling to come to terms with in terms of an AI-powered companion, right? So I think that this idea of what it means to be human, what it means to form a relationship with a machine, if that even is a good thing or a bad thing, and what that would entail in the future.
Isaac, that was a fantastic answer. Thank you. I could not have said it better myself.
Kim and Isaac, thank you so much for joining us. It was so incredible to hear all of your experiences, your learnings, your insight. This episode is incredibly valuable, and I hope that communities all over the world will be able to benefit from all of the learnings that you shared with us today.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you very much, truly.
That's it for this episode of Internet Changemakers. If you enjoyed it, subscribe and share. The internet is for everyone, and we all play a role in keeping it safe and open. Want to learn more? Visit internetsociety.org/learning for free self-paced courses on privacy, internet governance, and more. Support our mission to build a stronger, more inclusive internet, and consider donating via the link in the show notes. To connect with our global alumni network, visit our website and follow us online. Until next time, stay curious and help shape the Internet's future.